So thank you again for finding your way back to our first panel of the summit. As I said earlier, over the course of these next 2 days, we're going to have 5 different panels on gender, resistance, politics and sport, sports washing, a panel of former UConn athletes who have found their way to work in human rights, and a panel on business and human rights as well. With the panels, what we've asked is that each panelist respond to an opening prompt for no more than 10 minutes, and that the rest of the time be given over for conversation with the moderator and the panelist, and also leaving time at the end for questions from the audience as well. Our opening panel explores the very complex and evolving intersection of gender, sport, and human rights in the 21st century. It's brought together athletes, advocates, scholars to discuss how gender norms, discrimination, systemic social inequalities, and policy debates shape access to and participation in sport across all levels, from grassroots competition to elite competition. We've asked that the panelists share insights into steps that can be taken to ensure that sport is a space for dignity, fairness, and inclusion for all individuals regardless of gender. I'm pleased to introduce the moderator of the panel, Risa Izzard, who is Director of Research and Insights at Parity. In addition to her deep expertise and work at Parity, which focuses on professional women athlete sponsorships, we knew she was a perfect moderator for this panel when we discovered that not only did she run the fastest girls' mile in her middle school, but she also once wrote sports-themed fortune cookies for P.F. Chang's. So those 2 things, we knew we couldn't go wrong. Please join me in welcoming Risa and the panelists.
Thanks, Dr. Waller. Really privileged to be here, Dr. Risa Izzard, and I'm super excited to be moderating this session with friends, both old and new, and I know we're going to have a really good time. So I'm going to start with some abbreviated introductions for our panelists. There's a lot of the deep cut. I don't know if you all wrote fortune cookies for P.F. Chang's or not, but if you did, it'll surely show up in your bios in the program, so I'm going to keep it like pretty high and profesh. But we're joined today by, I'm going to start with Skylar. Skylar Baylor was the first transgender athlete to compete on an NCAA Division I men's team, competing for Harvard's swim team. He's authored the online gender literacy learning series, Lane Changer, a middle grade novel, Obi is Man Enough, and a best-selling book, He, She, They, How We Talk About Gender and Why It Matters. Skylar's also been recognized by Forbes 30 Under 30, the Out 100, the Olympic Channel, and the Ellen Show. Skylar, welcome. Next up, we have a Dr. Elise Ally Joseph. Dr. Ally Joseph is a citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma and a faculty member at Northern Arizona University, where she is the faculty athletics representative and serves as a member of the NCAA Division I Council. Her work highlights the importance of sports and physical activity as a vehicle for exercising sovereignty, empowerment, cultural identity, health, and educational attainment for Indigenous peoples. She is a founding member of the Indigenous Athletics Advancement Council, the IAAC, and the first ever Native Student Athlete Summit, which took place this summer. Join us in welcoming Dr. Ally Joseph. Dr. Amira Rose Davis is a faculty member at the University of Texas, Austin, where she specializes in 20th century American history with an emphasis on race, gender, sports, and politics. She's the co-author of the children's book, Go Wilma Go, I assume about Wilma Rudolph?
Yeah.
Absolutely. With Michael Long, and is finishing her book, Can't Eat a Medal, The Lives and Labors of Black Women Athletes in the Age of Jim Crow. Personally, her seamless integration of scholarship and practice, including numerous media outlets, the Jackie Robinson Museum, the Arthur Ashe Legacy Foundation, and must-listen-to podcasts, made her a role model for me even before beginning my PhD. It's an honor to be here with you, Amira. Join us. And last but most definitely not least, Dr. Anna Baeth is a sports sociologist, activist, and the director of research for the national nonprofit Athlete Ally. She has also co-authored 2 books, Fair Game, Trans Athletes and the Future of Sports and Queering Sport, Populism and Isolationism, What's Happening with Trans Athletes and What It Says About Us. Overall, her scholarship critically examines how sport institutions enforce exclusionary norms and how inclusive policies can uphold the human rights of all individuals. Join us in welcoming Dr. Baeth. So for the next 90 minutes or so, we're going to explore the complex and evolving intersection of gender, sport, and human rights in the 21st century. If I do my job well, we will examine how gender norms, discrimination, systemic societal inequities, and policy debates shape access to and participation in sports at all levels, from the grassroots to elite competition. And before we leave, I promise we will share steps that can be taken to ensure that sport is a space of dignity, fairness, and inclusion for all individuals, regardless of gender. To get us started, we're going to dive in deep. I'm going to pose a question, and each of you are going to have a chance to answer this one question before we dive into a bit more conversation back and forth across us. So, are you ready? Ready. All right, let's go. Question up for you. How can sports institutions balance inclusion and fairness when policies around gender identity and participation are increasingly politicized and contested? And Skylar, I'm going to ask if you can get us started.
Okay, I'm gonna hold this because I don't want to shout. Hi, everybody. I'm so glad to be here and so glad that you all are here. This is a really big question. And the first thing I always think about when we approach any question is, what is it actually asking of us? And are we using the same words when we are communicating about that question? And this might sound like a bunch of like fluff around it, but let's think about these words: inclusion and fairness, right? We hear these as big buzzwords all the time when we talk about sports. And we especially hear this when we talk about trans athletes. We hear this actually throughout history as well, about many marginalized groups being included in sports or being excluded from sports. So my first question, or my first response to the question, is actually a question, which is, what is inclusion? What is fairness? And how do we define this? When we talk about trans athletes, and this is something that I, as a trans athlete, have talked a lot about in my life and in my career, a lot of people will throw around this word fairness. Well, sports are supposed to be fair. We need to protect fairness. We need to protect fairness, right? And I'm always asking this question of, what do you actually mean by fairness, right? Is sports actually this universal level playing ground that it's sold to be, or are sports actually inherently unfair? And then the question is, if they are inherently unfair, which I'm going to argue that they are, what are those what facets of that unfairness are grounds for disqualification, and what do we actually let play as completely unfair that we say, hey, that's actually totally fine? In fact, let's celebrate those pieces of unfairness. So we actually have to break this question down before we can even start to address it. And I really want institutions, sports institutions specifically, to be thinking about these questions and communicating across, what does that actually mean to have fairness? Because there are things that are biological differences, for example, that are not actually biological advantages. So you have to figure out which of the biological differences, if we want to talk about biology, for example, are actually biological advantages. And then from there, we need to decide which of those are unfair. What biological advantages are unfair? Right? We've decided if you take exogenous drugs, for example, like, I don't know, Lance Armstrong, that is considered unfair, right? But if somebody's super tall, we say, wow, the NBA has everybody basically at 6'7" or 6'8", and we say that's great, even though that's technically unfair, right? So what's actually a grounds for disqualification? And then from there, we actually start to create a concept of what fairness is. But when we think about this, and we also hone in on biology, and this is specific, again, to trans athletes, I think we have to think really critically about what other factors are involved, right? Do people play sports only with their biology, or are there so many other systemic factors that have a massive impact on how we perform in sports? I'll give you a really clear example. In swimming, all right, swimsuits that you see people racing in the Olympics, those cost between $500 and $800. That swimsuit lasts on the package for 1 to 2 races, not 1 or 2 meets, 1 or 2 races. All right, $500, $600 per race. Okay, that's crazy. That means you have to buy those suits, and they actually do help you go faster. What about the parents that you're going to have drive you to practice at 4 a.m. and then again at 2:45 in the afternoon, which is what I did for all of my childhood? You have to have parents that can do that, or they can hire somebody that can do that. This is a tiny example. What about physical therapy? What about, resources for sports? What about the fact that there are places where there are no girls' sports teams, but there's tons of boys' sports teams, right? We could go on and on and on. What about racial disparities, right? What about the fact that up until the late 1960s, there were still pools that said no people of color, right? White only pools. When my parents were kids, that was still the case. When many of you, right, were kids, that was still the case. All right, so we have to think about these disparities and think about what are we talking about when we talk about fairness. So I know that didn't really answer the question, but that's what I'll say to start us off.
That's the start of a great panel. We didn't answer the question, but we got somewhere good. Baeth, can you take us next?
Yeah. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. So first, to piggyback off of that, I do want to point folks to an excellent resource. The Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport put out a report in 2021 that looked at all of the academic and gray literature around trans women. And so I think a lot of what you're talking about, Skylar, around what actually impacts athletic ability and what makes somebody a great athlete. What they talk about in the report is it's not biology, it's money. So I always point people to that to start. But Risa, this was a pretty long question, and I'm wondering if you would be willing to ask it again.
It would be my honor. How can sports institutions balance inclusion and fairness, define how you'd like per Skylar, when policies around gender identity and participation are increasingly politicized and contested?
Whew. Okay. So I want to start by saying I get this question a lot, like every day, or a variation of it. And like Skylar, this question leaves me with a lot more questions. So I'm a sociologist, which means I don't like to answer questions. I like to ask more questions. So I want to first start by saying, yes, I think we need to ask, what do we mean by fairness? I think we also need to ask, what do we mean by inclusion? And more importantly, I think when I look at this question, I think, okay, the idea that inclusion and fairness, you can't have one without the other, that is a false dichotomy. And I think we need to name that. So the idea that you can have inclusion and fairness, we need to name that. But I think we also need to think about the context of those two terms. So to Skylar's point, when we think about fairness, that is a very heavy word right now. And that is because it has been co-opted by politicians to talk about trans athletes. There's a long history there, and I don't want to get super into it. But I think it's important to name that we don't really know what we're talking about when we talk about fairness. And then on the other hand, there's inclusion. And I find inclusion fascinating because right now, the federal government is scrubbing this word from their websites, right? So on the one hand, we have this opaque term of fairness. And then on the other hand, we have this diminishing word of inclusion. It's being hollowed out. It's being co-opted in its own right. And so to use those two words and then to put them against each other, I think raises a lot of questions and also brings to the forefront the latter half of this question, which is that this is politicized. We are being intentionally polarized. These words are being polarized because people are trying to polarize us. So I want to just maybe foreground it there. Happy to continue, but I also know we have other voices here.
Amazing. Thanks, Baeth.
Yeah.
Elise, what do you think of when you hear this pretty big question?
That is a big question. Well, I first want to say, halito chamachukma sahochifoya Elise Ali Joseph chata siyohoke. I was always taught to introduce myself in my language. I know my grandma's listening to me if I don't, and I'll get in trouble when I go back home. So it's a way to ground myself and bring my community here with me and understand that I come from a long line of strong, powerful Chata women who got me to where I am today. And this is really important because in a lot of our Indigenous communities, including my own, we're matrilineal and matrilocal, meaning our lineage and our home go through our mother's side. And so as a woman, as a Chata woman sitting before you, I have a responsibility of reciprocity to my community, reciprocity to my land, reciprocity to future generations. And this really the heart of the work is how I carry myself through my advocacy through sport, from my advocacy through Indigenous communities. And so I might answer this question a little bit circular, but I'll get back to it, I promise. So for Indigenous communities, movement is ceremony. And that's not an abstract concept, because a lot of us believe that we didn't come into sport, we emerged through sport. It's in a lot of our creation stories, how we survived. And then we're also political sovereign nations. So we have 574 politically sovereign nations, the United States. And so movement is prayer, movement is survivance, movement is remembrance, and movement is futurity. And so when we're talking about sport, fairness, and inclusion, from an Indigenous perspective, it's also a form of exercising our sovereignty. And that term sovereignty is thrown around a lot, similar to inclusion and fairness. But in the context of sport and movement, we're literally moving our body to practice our cultural, physical, spiritual, and political citizenship. And so this is how I see fairness and inclusion, is through a sovereign space. An example is mentioned. My colleagues and I started the first ever Native Student Athlete Summit, mirrored heavily off the Black Student Athlete Summit. And so this summer at the Office of Inclusion at the NCAA headquarters, we brought together about 100 Native student athletes, educators, coaches, knowledge holders. And if you can imagine, we have a pretty small population. We make about 0.8% of NCAA college athletes, so very small. Similar to coaches, I'm the only Native faculty athletic representative in the country. And so it was so powerful to see our community come together and acknowledge each other, because a lot of times we're seen as an asterisk. And so when we come together and move beyond just representation to presence and story, that's medicine. That's inclusion and fairness. In a lot of our language, we do not have those terms. It's community, it's story, it's relationality, it's strength, it's kinship. And so I encourage us to think about, as we're moving through this discussion today, our own responsibility, our own terminology coming from our own communities, our own relationships. Because when we place these kind of foreign, colonial even concepts and try to put a circle in a square, it's not going to work. And for hundreds of years, that's what's happened to our communities. Policies have been implemented, for example, through American Indian boarding schools, to kill the Indian, save the man. Sport was a savior in these schools. Sport was introduced to further assimilate Indigenous youth. But what these institutions didn't know was sport, because it was so inherently tied to who we are as Indigenous peoples, was a form of agency, was a form of identity. We see this also as sport and social justice within our communities. My friend and colleague, Jordan Marie Daniels, runs. She's a professional runner. She runs with a red handprint over her face. This is a symbolization of our missing and murdered Indigenous relatives, our women, our two-spirit, our queer, our trans, our men, our children, go missing and murdered 10 times the national average. So she runs in prayer. She runs in community building. She runs in kinship. So when I think about this question, it's hard, these terminology, and again, I worked a lot with the NCAA, and I know that NCAA is not a great topic in this space, but I try to insert inclusion, fairness for our Indigenous athletes with the NCAA, right? And I ask in spaces, I ask people, are you being a good future ancestor? And a lot of times that stops people in their tracks, because maybe they don't even think about ancestry. But I'll leave it here, is to think about, and for our panelists to think about as well. Are we being good future ancestors? Okay.
Amira, bring us home.
Great. Hi. Good morning and all that. I don't actually know what time it is. I'm hoping it's still morning. So I'm a historian, and I'm going to be a historian today on this panel. I'm going to take the back half of that question when you said increasingly politicized and contested, because it's always been politicized and contested. There's no history of marginalized sporting bodies, women, people of color, that's ever existed in a sporting space that was not politicized and contested. So a lot of what I want to talk about today is giving some nuance and context to a lot of our discussions, because many times we enter these discussions with blinders that kind of only are oriented one way, to maybe the very recent past and the future, or the present, or whatever murkiness we're in. But oftentimes we are standing on very, very, very faulty foundation. And we're like, well, how did we get here? And why is it like this? And it's like, well, because it was set up like that 60 years ago, and we were not actually asking or answering the right questions then. And so now we're like trying to solve issues that we've never like gone back to the foundation of Title. I'm going to talk about Title IX in a second. Don't get me started, but here we are, whatever. So we're having conversations about these things. And when we're talking about inclusion, when we talk about the meaning of sport, a lot of this is asking us to excavate what values we attach to sport and why. Like, that's part of these conversations. Inclusion into what? Into what systems are we talking about? To build off what Elise is saying, as an example of this, for instance, we're gearing up for the clusterfuck that's going to be the Olympic Games in 2028. And one of the stories that you might be following is the attempts by the Haudenosaunee, which is the lacrosse team representing First Nations in Canada as well as in the United States, who invented lacrosse. Like, quite literally invented the game of lacrosse. But this is why we interrogate institutions, because they are fighting for inclusion to play lacrosse at the Olympic Games, right? And so you have people who are derived from the folks who literally made the game of lacrosse, which is now getting institutionalized and brought to LA 2028. And they are not fitting in, like Elise was saying, that box of participation, because that box we drew was around borders and nation states, right? So if we're starting from the premise of to be in the IOC, you need to be a nation state, whatever, we're already starting from a place of exclusion for things that exist beyond that. And I use that as an example because I think these are why it's important and imperative of us to have conversations that understand how we got here. I'll use another example to bring it back to gender. I don't know, those of you, I'm on TikTok because I have a 17-year-old and I'm in group 7. I don't know if you watched it. Thank you. Okay, yes. It's a group 7 thing you want to understand. But I don't know if you were watching some of the outrage on social media over the last month when the Vikings cheerleaders went viral because they have a man on the cheer team, right? That was a place where I was just begging for an ounce of historical understanding and nuance. Cheer started as a masculine enterprise. Cheerleading started for men. We had presidents who would be like, I'm presidential material because I was a cheerleader. I'm looking at you, Reagan. Yes, cheerleader. Anyways, Teddy Roosevelt, cheerleader. But again, it's because we have to look at what meanings we attach to things. So when we have cheerleading starting, it was seen as a masculinist enterprise because you were a leader. You were getting people to cheer. You were doing the masculinist expression of like cultivating school spirit, right? And over the years, in the mid-century, cheer was transformed into being attached to femininity. The shirts got tiny, the skirts got shorter, and it became, right, a way to express and pair femininity on the sidelines of what was becoming national pastimes like college football. And so to have outrage now about, oh, you're like forcing inclusion onto a cheer team is not only historically incorrect, it's just dumb, right? It's just like very dumb. But these are the conversations that we need to have. So when we're talking about inclusion and we're talking about the contested meaning of sports, I think it's important for us to say, what is at stake here? A lot of the reasons why we're running into hard conversations is because they go to the very roots of what we attach to and think about sporting spaces. So why are we policing gender? It's because of the meanings that we've placed about what a sporting space means for somebody's masculinity, or somebody who's transgressing their femininity because they, appear a certain way or look a certain way. I study Black women athletes historically. And that is a very interesting history because sometimes it's at odds to that box of what acceptable, respectable, feminine athletic ability looked like. So if you look at the early 20th century, you had a lot of fear about women's bodies and exertion. And so you had ideas that we had to move away from competitive athletics because competition was seen as masculine and that was bad. But also all of these like pseudoscientific ideas about the body. So women are barred from, say, running. There's a newspaper article in the 1920s that say if they run too fast or jump too hard, their uterus will fall out. And then what if you don't have a uterus, then like you're not fulfilling your purpose. You would have doctors saying, oh, we need girls rules basketball, right? 6 people on a court, you can't run because like, God forbid you sweat, right? These are the foundations of things that we're talking about today. And so when we're unpacking that, if you're looking at Black women athletes, that wasn't necessarily their history. They were already outside of this box of femininity. They had always worked. They had always labored, right? Their bodies were always seen as a category of other, which justified rampant sexual abuse on their bodies, among other things. And so in Black institutions in the early 20th century, unlike the Seven Sister Schools or some other schools, they had really competitive athletic opportunities using positive eugenics in the other way, which said, we need healthy reproduction to create a strong race. And this history is why Black women's athletics at HBCUs developed at a faster rate. So when you get into the mid-century and you're wondering why the entire track team is Black, it's because they had the infrastructure, right, to develop as athletes in ways that other people didn't. And so we can never enter these conversations with a president's attitude because oftentimes a lot of the answers we're looking for are actually in the past. That's my pitch for history also.
I love it. There's so many places we could go from here. I want to ask one more question that goes out to the whole panel, and then we'll dive into kind of some side conversations amongst ourselves and across and all of that. But listening to each of you speak, I heard a lot of kind of like, well, what is fairness? And this is a fake dichotomy. And maybe there's better words that describe the promise of sport in the first place, like community and connection and prayer and sovereignty and kinship. And maybe even historically and particularly in marginalized communities, sport has always been that, right? And so I'm curious, one, what's at stake if sport isn't delivering on that, isn't delivering on community, sovereignty, kinship, storytelling? Like, what are we missing today when we've divorced sport from that? And, big question, like, how do we get back there, right? So are there policies, are there practices that can help us make sure that sport actually is delivering on that? I think we all come to this conversation believing in the promise of sport and loving sport and playing sport and having our own sport story and knowing that sport is not inherently actually good or bad or anything. It's just what we make of it. So how do we make it kind of what we all hope it could be or believe that it could be and should be? And I'm going to start here with Elise.
All right. I mean, I think we have to go back to what I was talking about is sport is ceremony, sport is medicine, movement is medicine, and understanding the deep-rooted connection with sport in our communities. And also understanding, as Amira was talking about, when we think about what we're trying to fit in, and when anyone says to me, "Oh, like I can't believe the policies today. I can't believe what's happening in America. This is not our America," and I have to take a deep breath before I respond and say, this is literally the foundation. These policies, this settler colonialism, this genocide is literally what America was founded in. and you need to go back and do your research because I'm not going to talk to you anymore. No. But so for me personally in my research in communities, and again, I carry, I'm not here to represent all Indigenous people, but I've talked with a lot of Indigenous people and been in a lot of community, that we have to understand the cultural context of where we're coming from. And I say that and understand that I feel very fortunate today because I know where I come from. My community comes from Mississippi. We come from Naniwaya. We believe we came out of Mother Earth. I have that deep cultural connection. I speak my language. I'm teaching my children. And I understand today that a lot of Americans do not have that and are searching and grasping for that. And so I will come and I say, I am very privileged in that sense. And I'll be the first to say that. Because I know where I come from and I know where I'm going. So an example, and you shared lacrosse. In my community, we have something called stickball or ishtabole, which is similar to lacrosse. And we believe it's so inherently important to us in many aspects. It's in our creation story. It's how we healed community. Instead of going to war, we played, and women played stickball as well. And our hukum, our two-spirit relatives played as well. And when you look at contemporary stickball, it makes American football look so wimpy. Because you have women out there without shoes, bleeding, teeth flying out. You have kids playing this as well. But again, it's not just about the act of competition, the act of playing. We play for a higher purpose. And so when we're thinking about getting back to or having sport be this important community-based thing, we also have to understand when we work with Indigenous student athletes, the conversation is, yes, if you want to pursue a sport in college, that's wonderful to help you get an education. But that shouldn't be the end all. Play it because you love it. Play it because you know that it's empowering you as a person. You're gaining from your ancestors' strength to pass on to future generations. And so I think, as Pablo was saying earlier, we see we continue to define sports at this very high level today. But there's beautiful community sports happening. And that's where we really see this inclusion and fairness. And so if we can look at models, especially within Indigenous communities, if we look at basketball, if we look at lacrosse, if we look at stickball, and take notice and honor in the community building, in the relationship, and seeing old grandmas and grandpas there waiting for hours to get into gyms to watch their granddaughter and grandsons play. Like, that's beautiful. You get back to the heart of why we're doing this, of why we're moving our bodies, and why we're coming together in community. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Elise. Amira, how do you think about the promise of sport and how we actually deliver on that?
Yeah, I think so much, like many things in our wonderful country here, has been commodified. And that means that we start measuring success or importance of things based on their monetary value. You can see this if you go into any comment section, if ESPN tweets about women's basketball, for instance, right? It will be like, well, why do we care? It's not important. It's not good. You don't find that when they're broadcasting the Little League World Series, which was not, we know that Little League World Series is not like the best of baseball, but there's still a feeling of value and investment in that. But I think it really shortchanges a lot of how we think about sports, because if you accept the definition of a sport only being valuable or worthy in dollar signs, then we're missing a lot of possibilities. And it's also affected how we start the foundation of sports. So youth sports, My youngest is in AAU. What a scam. What a scam that is. What we were just talking about, what Skylar was talking about in terms of access and opportunities. His AAU, I can't even talk about it. It's so upsetting to me. The league fee is one thing, and then you're like, why is the uniform fee $150? Like they're going to outgrow it because they're 9, and they're like, oh, because it's home and away and practice jerseys. Do they need practice jerseys? I'm very upset about this. But then they charge you to go to the tournament, right? Like, my kid can't drive. Do you think I would willingly spend my Saturday morning at 3 games of 9-year-olds playing AAU basketball? Like, I am a hostage in this situation. And what do you mean it's $22 to come in? Whatever. But the point is, this is happening, right? Because the idea is, if you're not playing basketball at AAU, then you're being left behind. If you want to play and it's off season, you're being left behind. They're preying on dreams, and parents are like, well, shit, I want to make my kid's life good. Here's all the money. And I'm laughing because none of this is matter because we're not even through puberty. Half of these kids are going to be 5'2". You're not doing anything, right? Yes. But it's because we've already monetized youth sports, like we've already gender segregated youth sports. At times it doesn't matter. Like in 5th grade, I'm sorry, the people of competitive advantage in 5th grade are the girls who hit puberty, because they are going to be the strongest and fastest people in that room. But because we accept our ideas, right, already, then we import them into youth sporting spaces. It's been my middle kid, who is the least of my sports kid, has joined archery and now is a national champion in archery. Yeah, it's random. I had to spend a week in Utah. But it has been, for me, actually a really beautiful thing, because I'm up close to sports a lot. Formula One is my favorite sport. Most corrupt, money-fueled sport it is. It's also a nerd sport. I love F1. So I don't love sports. I love them, right? But his archery team has reminded me about what sports can look like when you disentangle it from these other kind of value statements that we've placed on it, like monetary gain, exposure, influencing culture, all of that. His coach has built a program in Austin. In 5 years has gone to over 500 archers. They are multi-time state champions, multi-time national champions at the elementary and middle school level. And it's wild because we walk into like these archery things, and everybody there, a lot of them are like hunters, like proper hunters. And our kids are from Austin, and they have like Trans Kids Matter stickers on their thing and dyed hair, and then they kick ass at archery. But the coach has these beautiful phrases where I'm like, this is fucking coaching, where you're getting all of these kids to buy into a structure. Like archery, only the top 12 schools like scores matter. And yet he has everybody building in, and he's talking about redwood trees, how redwood trees grow so tall because their roots entangle and strengthen each. What? Like, this is my Friday Night Lights at this point. But I was realizing in it, none of these kids are even shooting with a bow that puts you on the Olympic track. There's not scholarship money attached to their development here. They're not going to be like professional archers. And to be in a sporting space where you remove that and you're like, well, what are we developing here? And it goes back to these cliches that Pablo was talking about that like we kind of make fun of. But I'm like, oh my God, they're learning community. They're learning resilience. They're like these values that we attach to. And I think that that's, for me, when we're thinking about policy, right? Oftentimes we aren't, we haven't interrogated our values that we're actually trying to look for. I'll end by saying I was born in '88, so I grew up in the '90s. I was a tomboy in the '90s, coming to UConn, doing Olympic development soccer things here my entire life. That was me. So I grew up in the '90s when there was a big push of commercialization of women's sporting opportunities. So there was a very famous Nike ad called "If You Let Me Play." I had the poster on my wall, and now in retrospect, if you read back that poster, you're like, why the fuck was that on my wall? The entire campaign was about getting girls into sports. So it said this: if you let me play, I'll be more likely to leave a man who beats me. If you let me play, I will be less likely to, accept a job for less money. It was like these statements, right, about why girls should play sport, but they were all a little strange. So the ad was like 9-year-olds saying this, like, if you let me play sports, it had to be attached to this larger project that they were being enculturated into. And that was like the whole push. And I think that we haven't wandered far enough away from these ideas of like, we're only investing in this because we're seeing dollar signs at the end or we're seeing worthiness from that. Whereas if we stop and pause and say, well, what values are we actually trying to disseminate through sporting spaces? What are we hoping people take away from? What is the joy? Is it about community formation? I will say there's something about being part of something. I love being in collegiate sporting spaces, for instance. There's something beautiful about that, right? But not at the expense of thinking that that is the singular meaning of why we do what we do. And that's the policy disconnect between those values are a lot of what we're saying. I don't even know what you asked me.
We got there.
That's what you got.
Skylar, I mean, how are you seeing this policy disconnect, and what would better policies and practices look like so that we can deliver a sporting system that's inclusive of people of all genders and living up to, I think, the ideals that certainly those of us on this panel uphold, and my guess is would be fairly popular in the audience too?
Yeah. I mean, I think the shortest answer that I can give you is to include trans athletes, and into the perspective that I'm coming from is having trans inclusive policies. But that is sort of like a blank answer in my opinion, because the real question when we talk about trying to the sort of the high level question that you posed earlier, Risa, of how can we have sports be what we want them to be, right? And to have sports be all the things that we hope them to be, that sort of the reflection of the values. One of the things I like to think about, and this is going, I think, a little bit to Amir, your sort of contextualization of history also, is sports are a reflection of the society that we're in, right? And they always have been, and I think they always will be. And can they lead us forward? Sure, right? But they're still connected to society. And if anything, they are society. They are an expose, an expression, a performance of society. And I think if we think about that, we have to actually go back to what values are we constructing in a society? And earlier I heard Red speak when Pablo invited Red to speak, and they were talking about how we think about the construction of the society and the sort of full tilt lean or the actual cross boundary into fascism, right? And we think about this country and the people who are leading this country, the concentration of wealth, for example, into billionaires, right? I read recently a statistic about how, I don't know if it was like 30 years ago, there was like 15 billionaires in the world. Now there's hundreds, right? We have to think about where is the money and where are the values? And I this might not sound relevant to the answer to this question, but I think what I'm trying to say is I don't think we can just set a policy in sports and say that's going to fix this problem, right? I think we have to think about what are the values that we're walking around in our lives and what kind of people are we being to those of us around us. I think advocating at high level policy is a fantastic way to make change. But what I really focus on is how can we interpersonally be better, because society is made up of people interacting with each other. And so every interaction that you all have with each other, with yourselves, with your own gender, with other people's gender, with a society of gender, every interaction contributes to a society of values, right? And if we value gender as the most important thing about somebody else and we box them before we even meet them, which I bet all of you do, including myself, the first thing we notice about somebody is what gender they are, or we notice that we cannot gender them. Right? Notice that for the rest of today. When you meet somebody, the first thing you're probably going to do is gender that person. Right? Why? Where does that come from? Why do we do that? Right? There are some languages, historically speaking, that didn't have the word for women. Right? Yoruba tribe in historic Nigeria. Right? That is a society that didn't have that word. And we were talking about what words we have. If we think about that and we think about the possibility where there are societies where gender was not as important or maybe just irrelevant to where we are now, that's almost impossible to imagine. And so impossible that Fox News and so much of the alt-right, the anti-trans movement, has capitalized that as common sense. But what is common sense if not, again, a reflection of the bigotry and misconceptions of a society? Right? Is that common sense or is it common bigotry? So I think we have to think about these systems of oppression, and the answer to the question, I think, for me, is actually in the interpersonal relationships that we have. Is there ways that we are willing to challenge our own gender understandings, of our own understandings of our own gender, but also of those around us? Are there ways we can start to break down the ways that we have totally internalized systemic oppression, settler colonialism, right, colonization as a whole, right? The ways that I think the values of how do I say this best, sort of the values of this country that we may not actually want to name, right? But they are actually what the country is built on. As Elise was saying earlier, right? Country is built on genocide, built by people stolen from a different continent, forced to work and forced to build many of the buildings that you all have seen in this country. Right? If that's the values, right, that we're built off of, where are we now? And are we actually walking forward, right? Holding those values, upholding them? A lot of us are, in small ways and in big ways in our life. How can we interrogate that, break those down, and start to shift society from that sort of like central point of each of our own actions? I think that will also help us in terms of policy and sport. So bigger picture, kind of zooming out, but zooming in.
Love it. Baeth, you want to take us home on this one?
Yeah. So what's at stake? I've been doing this work for about 5 years. I came into this work from sport. I'm a collegiate field hockey coach, and ended up being hired out of my PhD to work for an LGBTQ rights organization. And I have to say, at that moment in time when I was hired, maybe like some other students in this room, I was just looking for a job. And then I started doing this work, and I started getting asked a lot of questions about trans athletes. And I started to do my homework. And I realized that I think when it comes to trans athletes, it's much darker than just compromising values. For me, I love sport, like a lot of people said here, because I think it is a connector. It is designed so that we can socially connect through it, and so that we can be human in that process. It is a humanizing practice to be in sport. And the dark irony for me with what's happening around trans athletes and gender in sport right now is that sport is being used to dehumanize and to isolate us. Red, I really appreciated your comments earlier, and you said you really see this as a vehicle for radicalization. And I would actually say, I think the way trans athletes are being treated is a vehicle for dehumanization and to isolate those communities. And I think when I really take a step back and I think about dehumanization and what that means for us right now, I really reflect a lot on how Black Americans have been treated in this country. And I'll do a little history here, a little theory. I turned to Black feminist theorizations around this. I looked to the work of Sylvia Wynter. If there are any theorists in the room? Sylvia Wynter has written a lot about the construction of Blackness as an identity in the United States. And she talks a lot about how it was constructed because policymakers needed something as an alternative to whiteness. So we needed to create this identity of Blackness so that there were Black folk and there were white folk. And the idea there was then you separate the two, and we know how that turned out. I think we are in a moment where transness is being constructed as an alternative to cisgenderness or normative gender presentation. And that is because when we can define transness or non-normativeness, however you want to phrase it, we can then categorize people who are trans and then cis people, normative folks. And the idea there, again, is by constructing these identities, we can separate and we can ultimately make policy and decisions that would oppress trans folks. And so, yeah, okay, this is about values in sport, right? Like I want there to be social connection through sport. But for me, it's also about why is this happening now? And what are the consequences for the next 2 decades? Because the policies that are coming into play now are going to be around for the next 50 years. And that's terrifying.
That's 100%. And I think it's so important. You mentioned sport being a reflector of society. I also want to talk about it as a laboratory where ideas are played out in an accessible way, right? And using history, I think we can look at Jack Johnson, the boxer, as a really good example of this, to ask that question, what is the threat, right? Like, what's at stake? So Jack Johnson's competing as a boxer at the turn of the century in 1906, 7, 08, and he's really good, right? But at the time, you're dealing with scientific racism being part of an argument that Black folks are inferior in all ways. They're genetically inferior, they're intellectually inferior. So what's at stake if Jack Johnson is knocking people out in a boxing ring is an entire structural value system that is propping up a segregated society, right? That's the risk, is that people who are like, I don't care about politics, I'm not going to, they're apolitical or whatever, but they go watch boxing. Yeah. And you watch Jack Johnson knock somebody out and you're like, wait, I thought we were the master race, I'm confused, right? Which is why there was a search for the Great White Hope, like literally, right? And why was Jack Johnson so offensive? It wasn't just because he was winning, but he was also driving cars and wearing fur and messing with white women, which was really the thing that, got him locked up. But then you think of how interconnected this is. So the same Judge Kennesaw Landis, who locked up Jack Johnson for violating the Mann Act, which is transporting a woman across state boundaries, became the commissioner of Major League Baseball and was very influential in maintaining the color line in Major League Baseball. Why? Because he was worried about the women who would come to the ballpark and see men that they might be attracted to who weren't white, right? So the color line gets fiercely maintained, right, through these ideas about what the threat could be in these sporting spaces, is that it uproots ideas about inferiority, it uproots ideas about access and value. And so the same conversations we're having about like what meanings do we attach to sport, when we're talking about marginalization, it's also why, and we have a great keynote coming tomorrow on disability, but it's also why it's imperative to have these discussions about sporting opportunities for varying body types, abilities, etc., because it goes to the same idea, right? Is that if we in sports are saying everybody here is marginalized or different and other, it becomes a laboratory in which to practice things, good or bad, about accepting people or not. Yep. And the threat of athletes who challenge that at all points in history has been because it's not merely reflecting society, but it's positioning sports as a laboratory in which to access new ideas about ability, new ideas about justice, new ideas about things that upend what you thought you knew about difference or marginalization. So that's one of the at stake myths of it.
Elise, I want to bring you into this conversation because I think Indigenous communities have wrestled with sport in oppressive regimes for the entire history that, quote, Americans have been here. And so I'm curious, kind of twofold, right? So one is, how have Indigenous communities, particularly, I know you can speak to the experience of Choctaw, and I know your husband's Hopi, right? And so like these communities that you're pretty proximate to, navigated gender in sport, given these wider understandings of gender in many Indigenous communities around being two-spirit, around being Mahu. And simultaneously, right, like they've also done this, your people have also done this in the midst of oppressive regimes, right? In the midst of structures and institutions like boarding schools that have tried to use sport in pretty violent ways. So can you connect many of these threads for us from kind of your community's experiences?
Yeah, thanks. Yes, as y'all are talking, I'm just thinking about, yes, Indigenous communities have experienced this as well. Yes. And I mentioned this briefly, but I want to circle back to it, is as we're contemporary talking about these policies on that are deploying attacks on our bodies and our identities. This is, of course, nothing new for Indigenous communities. And as I mentioned, we can really go back to the American Indian boarding school system. School, in quotations, more like scary medical laboratories, institutions, just very awful, scary spaces. But it was carrying on from settler colonialism to genocide to saying, shit, these Indians are still here. What do we do with them? They're not going away. We thought they would die off naturally. We thought we could kill them off in war, but they're still here, right? So these assimilationist policies really rooted in American ideology. The federal motto was kill the Indian, save the man. And this isn't necessarily saying kill, shoot them dead, although I'm hoping you've seen, at least in the news, or heard or had discussions around thousands of Indigenous youth being unearthed in mostly unmarked graves in Canada and the United States in these boarding school systems. But kill everything Indigenous, kill language, kill culture, kill connection to community, family, and a lot of times instill the importance of sport and competition, right? And as I mentioned before, sport had this beautiful side effect for Indigenous communities. And I think because we have that cultural connection. So these systems didn't know what hit them, in a sense. But at the same time, implementing these very binary gender definitions, as we've talked about up here. For a lot of our Indigenous community, gender is very fluid or inclusive. There's a lot of terminology that I don't really like because it doesn't translate in our languages, right? It doesn't. We all have roles and responsibilities in our communities, and the term two-spirit was come about in the 1990s to reduce and take place of these very awful colonial terms that were placed upon our communities. I have a lot of trans Indigenous friends. Some like two-spirit, some don't. So I have to be wary of that. But when we look at contemporary sporting experiences, unfortunately, and to be honest, because of settler colonialism, a lot of our communities have taken on these roles as well. And it's further displacing our queer, trans, and two-spirit relatives because they historically didn't have to fight to fit into community. They were part of community. But when these colonial systems have such a lasting impact, and now we have to fight for rights, we have to fight for space, we have to fight for presence, and then we come back into our Indigenous communities and say, I'm fighting for this space, again, it doesn't fit because historically they've never had to fight for these spaces, right? And when you look at policy and procedure, if you look at especially NCAA policy, looking at Charlie Baker's response, which I wanted to throw my computer at Charlie Baker, sorry, when he said that there's only 10 trans student athletes. I don't know, Pablo talked about that, like only 10. We're making this big hype for only 10. If it was only one, does that make a difference? It's a human being. It's a human life we're talking about. And we know there's not only 10. We know that it's unsafe for some of our trans, queer, and two-spirit relatives to even talk about who they are because they're being murdered, they're being raped, they're being molested, they're being thrown out of community because of it. So we know there's more. And again, who cares how many? Who cares the number? Again, I could talk about numbers because we are small in numbers, but we're mighty in story. Yeah. We're mighty in presence. And so when we look at policy around trans, especially two-spirit within, it's the terminology two-spirit, like a lot of our Indigenous, is, an asterisk. It's not significantly researchable, right? But if you look in our communities, if you look at the sporting experience in our communities, we're very inclusive. We are. If you look at travel sports programs, adaptive sports programs, we are extremely inclusive. So again, like I said before, if we can look at that community context rooted in who we are as human beings, where we come from, the land, the language, the kinship, the community, the strength. Look at the protective factors. Because we are still here. We are still here. I'm going to say it one more time. We are still here.
I know Amira has some brilliant things to say, and I want to hear them. I also know that all of you have brilliant questions. And so as I keep an eye on time, I want to invite you to start thinking about what your questions are so that in the next few minutes when we open it up, you're ready to ask them.
Elise, I was going to say that's so important. I do this exercise in class. I'll do it now. Can you raise your hand if you could name 2 or 3 Indigenous athletes that you know of? Okay. Now raise your hand if you could name 2 or 3 Indigenous mascot names for teams. Right. So the disparity in hands, if we were in my class, we'd do it a lot full out and you see the disparity. But like this is part of, what we're talking about when we're talking about sports as a laboratory, is if the visibility and recognition that you have that associates indigeneity with sport only as mascot, right? It's how we miss the long sporting traditions that Elise is talking about.
Yeah, I'll just say too, because I'm always hesitant to bring up mascot because I feel like, just like you said, when we talk about Indigenous sporting experiences, always to mascot, always. And mascots are extremely important. There's a long historical context there, but we miss so many other beautiful stories and experiences. So I really encourage you, one, to understand the history of the mascot and where that comes from, where Redskin comes from, where Chief comes from, where Braves comes from. But listen to the communities and the context behind those stories. Listen to the experience of the athletes that are playing on those teams or playing in college or playing in community. So,
Skylar and Amir, I want to ask both of you this question, then we'll open it up to the audience. But, right, we're sitting in, I feel like kind of a Charles Dickens movie of like it's the best of times and the worst of times, I guess a book, not a movie. Right, so on the one hand, there's any number of injustices that are being perpetuated in sport right now, particularly for trans athletes or intersex athletes and women athletes, right, still. And we're sitting at a time where there are more girls participating in high school sports than we've ever seen since we started tracking this, right? Keep in mind that number is actually still lower than the number of boys who did it in 1972 pre-Title IX, but like we're getting there. We're almost closed the gap to boys in 1972. Go us, I guess, maybe, right? We have higher valuations. We have attendance records. We have really complex dynamics in lots of women's pro sports leagues, but like also they're mainstream, and this shirt has sold out like more times and raised literally more than $6 million for Together, who can tell now amazing stories about women athletes, right? So like all of this is happening right now. Why? And how do you make sense of it?
No.
Okay. Yeah. Why now? So I think I'm not a historian, but I'm going to put the historian cap on for a second and think about where we're coming from, right? So we've had several sort of waves, or not several, but a few waves of civil rights movements in the past century, and we've made gains moving forwards. We're in a place right now, I think, and one of the things I've heard from a lot of politicians on either side of the political spectrum, saying things like, well, the Democrats lost because of trans athletes. Right? That's a common statement that people have made. Again, even Democratic people have said this. And this is, as a trans athlete, I would say it's probably one of the most infuriating things I've heard people say, for so many reasons. Because first of all, this is not the reason that the election was lost. Second of all, if we are talking about trans athletes at all being involved in the conversation right now, the thing that lost the election would then be transphobia, not trans athletes. I think it's really important to name that the problem is the phobia, the ism, the systemic oppression. It's not the trans person or the yes. It is never the marginalized group that's the problem. It is the systemic oppression that oppresses that group that everybody or the majority buys into, right? So we have to name that difference. So going back to your question, right, why are we here? The answer is because systemic oppression hasn't been dealt with. We have not actually dealt with that question. And when we've made rules to try to deal with that question, we're doing so from a place of not having the right people in the room, not answering the right questions, and not giving the right resources to the right people. And I'll break that down. Even we can look at this table right here. We're having a conversation about gender and sport. I want you to ask yourself, who's not sitting at this table right now, right? One of the biggest conversations of our time right now is about trans athletes. Yes, we have one trans athlete on this panel. I'm not a trans woman, right? That is a huge statement to make, just to say who is here, right? We're talking about trans women in sports. We're talking about trans athletes in sports, and we have one trans athlete, we don't have a trans woman. This is not a shot at the people who put this panel together. I think it's a fantastic panel. I don't want anybody not to be here, but we have to ask ourselves who is at the table, right? Who's missing from the table? Okay, and when we think about then the resources that are allocated, the decisions that are being made, we'll go back to Title IX, right? A recent history situation, right? Who made that decision? Who were the people who were involved at that table? And then if we think about the concept of the women's category being a protected category, and this is the language that constantly shows up when we talk about trans athletes in sports, protected category, your next question should be protected from what? Why is it a protected category? Who and what are we protecting from? And the answer is patriarchal harm, right? The answer is misogyny. So if we come back to those systems, right, and we think about who is at the table, who are making these decisions, what actually are we trying to solve? I think there's a different conversation that we need to have, right? So I am now forgetting the beginning of the question, but I hope I've addressed parts of it.
Amira will pick up the parts you.
I'm sure she will.
Yes, exactly. We are the why now is very interesting in many ways, but also the movements that we're talking about have always been a dance of a few steps forward, a few steps back. We've always been in a place where it's what can we give? How many inches can we give to control the mile, right? And so what I mean by that is, like, we'll hear a lot about Title IX. Does anybody know how many words are actually in the Educational Amendment of 1937? So close. 37 words, right? So when you think about Title IX and the far-reaching impact it's had, it's 37 words, intentionally vague sometimes, right? But oftentimes we've talked about Title IX in reference to sport. It wasn't an athletic amendment. It was an educational amendment that then they fought for a decade to exempt football and athletics from it. They lost those fights. So for the first premise, you have the NCAA as an entity that spent a decade suing to have nothing to do with women's sports, then being in charge of it, right? But the thing about But the thing about Title IX that also happens around it is that we take it as this shining legislation that blocks out all the other possibilities that were happening around the time. There was a lot of energy around women's sports since the 1920s, like I mentioned earlier, right? In the 1920s, women were like, hey, we're excluded from participating in athletics at the Olympic level. This woman in France was like, fuck that, we're gonna make our own women's games. And at first they were ignoring it because they were like, nobody's gonna go to the Women's World Games in France in 1922. Guess what? People went. And you had the president of the AAU at the time say, it's over. The women have discovered sports. We cannot control them anymore. We must standardize their games, right? The concession is you couldn't stop women from playing sports, so you had to hyper-regulate it, right? So that meant that there was a debate, and they said, please stop using the word Olympics in the Women's World Games. We'll bring you into the fold. We'll start putting women's events in the Olympics if you drop Olympics branding, #branding. And so that was the deal that was struck. And so in 1928, you have the first, you have women's track events included in the Olympic Games. And they took pictures of women collapsing at the finish line of the mile and said, we told you women are too weak to run the mile. This is case in point. And the mile then dropped off, right? Any distance above 800 dropped off for women athletes until when? 1968 is the first time you get even the 800 run again. And swimming, yes, exactly. So when we're talking about structural bans, right? Women's proper football, like soccer, was so popular in Europe. The women's games were so popular that they outlawed women playing soccer. Like the FA Federation outlawed it. So when you're talking about, the development of the Super League is so behind, it was outlawed for fucking decades. Of course it's behind. In 1971, you had how many people? I wish Brenda was here. She would tell me. In 1971, they staged a Women's World Cup because it wasn't included in the World Cup. And they sold out, the Mexico City Stadium, which somebody Google it and tell me the number. It was a huge number, right? That the threat was not that people wouldn't come. The threat that it was people that would. Right? So then you have Title IX coming in. You have the AIAW that was overseeing women's sports who are asking questions like, what does it actually mean to put a vision of sports? Like, we're talking about corruption in college sports. We're talking about all these issues. Do we want to just fold women's sports into a system we're already critiquing? We're talking about exploitation there. Do we want to fold them in? But those conversations were shut down when Title IX passed. Because what you then have is people coming in and taking control. And we think about Title IX, but we don't think about the consequences. So we know that it has expanded opportunities on the field and on the court. But when Title IX was passed, in terms of women coaches of women's sports at the collegiate level, you're talking about 96%. That number is under 50 today. Administrators, you're talking about now just 15% of administrator positions held by women. These are the consequences of Title IX as well, if we don't reckon with them. And then we're talking about professional sports and opportunities today. I think it's exceedingly important to have conversations about how that growth has happened and where is it still stagnant and why. Because structurally, I know we're very mad at Kathy and the W, and that makes sense, and pay the players and all that, but 50% of that league is still owned by NBA ownership, who has wanted to devalue it because it's better for their tax breaks. Like we're talking about structural impediments to actual payment and things like that. And so as we are at a moment when we have to ask, what is the cost of new popularity? Like, I'm glad that people are, like, now that sports betting is a thing, you're seeing more inclusion in sports betting because people are betting on women's sports. They're also betting on when women athletes get their periods. Right? We've seen the dildos being thrown on the court, right? We've been seeing these systems. And the last thing I'll say is the biggest growth after Title IX were also the least diverse sports. The where the actual growth was in Title IX were upper middle class sports that were predominantly done by white women and white girls. We have never applied everybody in every community has not had those same access points. So when we're talking about youth sports and pay-to-play systems, it's who's being left out of that. Why are these sports still inaccessible? And so as we're thinking about this moment now, it has always been trying to get on the court. And now it's, if you want to be paid a woman athlete, it's influencer culture, right? And this is not new. It's why Maria Sharapova had way more deals than Serena, right? Even though she beat her, right? So again, it goes to these things where it's not this meritocracy. It's not that. We should stop pretending that that's what it is. We can't divorce these logics from a racist capitalist system, which is what people are inherently, taking part of. And I'll end with saying, it's really important for us to think about this in a college campus and college space that we're at. I just wrote an article about the 70s. At the beginning of the 70s, they were like, this is the end of college sports because there's been athletic activism that they were like, oh, those pesky athletic activists. And then the women were saying, hey, we should play sports too. And so there was article after article in newspapers that was saying, this is the end of college sports. It's over. We're not profitable. It's done. By the end of the decade, right, boosterism had come back. They had replaced athletic scholarships to be 1 year renewable, and you could be dismissed at the whim of a coach or athletic director, which cut down on any activism that was happening because now it's all on your coach to say if you were disruptive or not, right? And then you have Title IX happening. And in that moment, we have structured what we're now dealing with as modern athletics. So I know that we like to bemoan about the portal or NIL, and we can keep talking about that. But I think it's important to know that the average people making money from that system is like $50 of deals, right? And we have to think about it in terms of higher education itself. There's many professors who have nice little NIL deals, who get paid to talk, who are on your radio or your TV. But that is a shield for a system that is mostly adjunctifying, that is bleeding people dry within the field. And it's higher ed is under attack, and we're seeing these things, and they can't be disaggregated from the sporting conversation. So the same way we talk about realignment, we have to talk about what's happening, all of these things together. And so the why now, it's been like this, but we're at a moment in which we're trading social capital for actual capital in women's sports, and the activist tradition there is actually under threat. Okay, that was also a rant.
So we've got 12-ish minutes, and we'd love to hear from as many of you as we can in that time. I know that there's mics going with 2 runners, so we'll take as many questions as we can get to. With the glasses and the red hair. Yeah, right there.
Hi. Beyond participation, how would you measure progress and achievements towards gender equity, equality, and inclusion?
Can you say it one more time, just a little bit louder?
Beyond participation, how do you measure progress and achievements towards gender equity, equality, and inclusion?
Awesome. Who wants to take it? Baeth, you're the researcher. How do you measure progress?
Oh, gosh. Well, I think we have to look at the major issues that are affecting gender marginalized folks in sport. And by that, I mean anybody who is not a cisgender man. I would love to see progress around virtual assault on athletes, what's happening in social media. I would love to see progress around sexual assault and sexual harassment in those spaces. I would love to see progress around abuse writ large. I think that is the biggest issue in sport that we're not talking about and that we're not measuring, or not measuring as much as we could and should.
Can I just add quickly? I would also add to that, progress is around mental health. We know that our student athletes have suicidal ideations, dying by suicide at a very high rate. And I think it has everything to do what we're talking about today, of not being able to be their true full selves in these spaces, being defined as just an athlete or a dumb jock, etc. So I think, to me, participation is like at the lowest point of importance in these spaces. It's about being human and be able to come as your whole self.
Awesome. Thanks. And then do you want to pass the mic right next to you? There's another hand there.
Hi, cis guy here, gay, but still cis. I was never that into sports. I did sports throughout like elementary school, middle school, into high school, but I never really felt that sense of community. And I feel like a lot of that came from like the idea of parents thinking my kid's going to be the next star. It's the money, it's the pressure. Like I did soccer, never felt any sense of community there. You know, all the kids were in their little isolated bubbles, you know. The only time I ever really felt community, it was on a middle school swim team where, you know, when we were practicing, no community whatsoever. The coach was all focused on results and never fostered anything in the group. The only time was in the locker room for like 5 to 10 minutes at a time. And I feel like my question, I know it's a little deviating from the subject of this talk, but how do you think the best ways are to build communities in those kinds of spaces where the administration and the parents are just not there for that reason?
Sure, I'll say in that capacity. Yeah. One of the things I think about a lot when we think about, especially like youth sports, which is what you're naming, is who are we regulating? And what I mean by that, and I guess another word is who are we controlling, and who's really participating in the sport. And I think about my own childhood, and there were actually parents that would come and stand at the door into the swim, like to the pool, and like stare, and then they'd yell at their kids on the sideline. They'd pull them out. They'd tell them all kinds of horrible things. And part of the coach's job was actually to be a barrier between the parent and the kid. And now I do a lot of work in schools trying to do inclusion work, and a lot of my work is also trying to talk to parents and trying to get them to shift. And so it's really interesting when we think about youth in general, and you're right, this sort of deviates somewhat from this, but it's really about like, what is the container around the sport, right? And the container is the coaches, the society, the school, the administration, and their parents. And I think that when we think about, creating rules, we have to think about who's actually participating in that. And a lot of times for youth sports, it is parents, right? And when I think about the inclusion of trans athletes, for example, the people who are shouting at trans kids or any gender deviating appearing person are parents. Right. There was a story recently about some 8-year-old girl who was like booed out of a stadium in a Canadian running match game, whatever it's called. I don't run, clearly. Meet. Thank you. Oh, it's the same as swimming. Okay. Anyways, so this person was screamed at, and it was like some old man who had nothing to do with the sport. Why was he even there? I don't know, but that's a sketchy question, right? So I think we have to consider, right, what are the bodies around these conversations that are actually the stakeholders. And then my question is, why are they the stakeholders, right? Why are we paying more attention to what a parent thinks about something versus what the actual kid is doing in the sport? So that's a kind of like a question to your answer, your question, but hopefully it helps.
But it goes to the participation question too, because so oftentimes our eyes are trained only on the athletes. And sports and our sporting landscape are so much more vast than that. So when we're talking about, and it goes back to what I was saying about Title IX too, if you only measure it in participation of athletic participation, then the actual sporting landscape is not changing, right? Until we think about these same questions in coaching, in management, in agents, in journalism, in GMs, right? Those, the sideline has not changed. The upper box management has not changed. The folks in the room making media deals, right, demographically look the same. And so we're talking about at the youth level and on up, because we're focused on the athletes, it's the same way when I'm a labor historian, and you'll hear this in other panels today when we talk about labor. And why unionization is hard, because when there's lockouts and things like that, they're like, oh, those spoiled billionaires, whatever. Out of the sporting landscape, athletes often have the most control and regulation on them and the least long-term financial solvability. And so these other areas are just as important to have the conversations in, because without them, you're not actually changing the landscape at all.
It's really, really quick. It's one sentence. I want us to consider, are our athletes puppets, or do we make them agents, right, with their own agency? And I think we can apply this to like any sporting community. Are we treating the athletes as puppets, where they are, they're slave to a brand deal, or to their coaches, or to the parents, or whatever? Or do those athletes participate in sport because they want to and because it's their agency that they are concentrating?
All right. We're running out of time, so we're going to take 3 questions. You're going to boil it down to like your one sentence, and then our panel is going to answer them together. So I'm going to do one in the back, another in the back, and then here. Oh. Yeah, in the back, Yetza.
Yeah, 2 comments and a question. First, Risa, this is an amazing panel. I think you should pitch a podcast, a parody or something, where everyone on the panel is literally on your podcast. I found myself wanting to hear a lot more about the indigenous sport culture that Dr. Ali Joseph was talking about, and the archery program that Dr. Davis's middle child is involved in. And so my question is, how can we use technology and maybe even storytelling to start to memorialize those model systems where kinship is centered over costs, and disseminate it so others can learn more about those spaces? I want to hear about the redwood trees. I think everyone should hear about the redwood trees. I want to hear about stickball. I think everyone should hear about them. So rather than trying to, force our seat at a table that's not built for those types of spaces, how can we start to disseminate at scale these newer tables or old tables that are being built and working?
Okay, so that's one question. Can you go like 4 rows up? There was a gentleman on the end. We'll hear the 3 questions and then we'll tackle them.
A question for Elise. From your experience on the NCAA Division I Council, has there ever been discussion that the primary purpose of the NCAA should be to be expansive and to maximize the number of athletes or students that get the intercollegiate athletic experience, where you learn 2 very important skills, teamwork and time management?
Awesome. And then right up here in front.
Hi, my question was actually for Dr. Davis, as me and all my siblings have and are AAU student athletes. So I wanted to ask you, based on your experiences, as a mother of AAU student athletes, how do you encourage your kids to remain grounded and focused in an athletic society that exploits the importance of collegiate exposure and success onto your young student athletes?
Awesome. Let's start with Dr. Ali Joseph.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Mine's really easy. I just was wondering if you know. We talked a lot about.
Yeah,
Can you
yeah.
hear me? Sorry, I'm delaying us. There was a lot of mention of policy, so I'm just wondering if you are aware of any lobbyist groups specifically trying to attack this, not with the NCAA, but with our legislature.
Gender justice.
Dr. Ali Joseph, you want to?
Yeah, athlete ally, gender justice. I'll quickly say, so yeah, if you look at like the statistics of NCAA athletes, one of the top 4 indigenous is archery, but it's because archery is very small and we have like 3 indigenous archers. So, but yes, I agree, and the importance of not sitting at a table that was not built for us. I don't want to be sitting at that table, right? And so I think there is a movement through storytelling coming from our indigenous communities. There's a lot of great organizations, Decolonize Sport, one of them, my nonprofit, and the Native Student Athlete Summit, where we're taking this more storytelling approach, because historically that's what we do, is tell story, and not necessarily writing it down, right? It's a living, breathing entity that's supposed to adapt, that's supposed to change. The D1 Council, which is now the D1 or the D1 cabinet, we have a lot of conversations, and we've brought in student athlete voice to those conversations. I will say, I probably shouldn't say this, but it's still very much led by white commissioners. The decisions that are being made, their voices are very strong, and I would say I've sat on for 5 years, and it took me about a year to find my voice in that space, because I, in a sense, was a little intimidated because of it. I found my voice now, and they probably don't like when I raise my hand, but there's still a lot of work to be done to get to the root of fairness, teamwork, etc.
Cool. Dr. Davis, bring us home.
That was a beautiful question. All of these questions are so good. I'll work backwards. I work a lot with athletes to give them space to think about what empowerment means, and how, as you're growing, your priorities might shift within the sport as well. And I work with athletes at many different levels, but I work a lot with athletes at the college level who are then going into professional ranks. And it's a very interesting moment, because up until then, they've gotten used to a certain playbook. Like, you have to practice like this, think like this, do this, that's a distraction, you can't do that. And oftentimes we use the space to be to facilitate like cross dialogue, because part of what happens is people get really siloed. I don't know if you've ever tried to live a day in the life of a collegiate athlete, right? You can be very siloed in that, intentionally, by design. Like, I taught at Penn State for years before I taught at UT, and it was literally like, if I didn't walk to one side of campus, I would never see my athletes who were students. And just facilitating space for dialogues about what sports means and what beyond sports moves you, right? Like, what does it mean to be more than an athlete? And those conversations has often built times where people are like, okay, now I want to get involved with this nonprofit, or I want to use my platform for this, or I want to talk. There's been now a lot more commissions on mental health, for instance. And that's been really athlete led. And so that's like my biggest thing, is creating spaces for that dialogue to happen, so people can decide what they want to do through sport still, or in absence of it. And then I'll end by thinking about this question, which I love. So if I had have a podcast, I don't know. So Burn It All Down was a podcast, is a podcast that I did with 4 other folks that was about telling stories that you might not hear, or interviewing voices that might not always be the first voice you hear about. And the beauty in that was that we have like over 500 episodes. You can burn it all down, feminist sports podcast you need. But also what we ran into is this table question, right? Where people were like, well, we want you to debate each other. And it's like, we actually like all believe that trans athletes should be protected. So like, what are we debating, right? Like it would be, we debate things. Like we're in a fierce debate right now about like the impacts of the World Cup. I debate my Canadian co-host all the time about words. She keeps calling a beanie a toque, and I'm just like, but we're not going to debate like base level things, right? We're going to shape this conversation differently, and that means it's not fitting into the existing media structure around these stories. And that's why Risa was talking about Together, who also endeavored to say, like, what if we told stories? What if we brought up, I mean, when we started Burn It All Down, women sports got 4% of national coverage. That's up to 11, 12, 20, you know, it's not up high. And I think that that is really important. The ways that we can continue to do this, and it's happening in really exciting ways. We had an explosion of sports bars, for instance. We have ours in Austin since 1972. Jenny started it in Portland, of course, with the sports bra. So thinking about what spaces are coming up organically that are saying, hey, we want an alternative to the sporting landscape that we exist in, to tell these stories or to put a new spin on it. Like let me talk about F1. It won't be the same discussions you get on those, but that's all the better, right? So I think that the work that y'all are doing, Athlete Ally is a part of this, but I think the stories are out there. It's just about when we create those alternative spaces, figuring out how to support them so that they can continue to flourish. Because what they're running up into is funding structures who say, well, we will only support you if you then become the Barstool model. And it's like, well, if I was the Barstool model, then we wouldn't be doing what the fuck we were doing, right? So anyways, go find independent journalism, support it. Find these nonprofits and organizations that are keeping track of policy and giving you great lobbying interventions. And then also interpersonally have these conversations. Sports can be really fun and you can be hypercritical of it, and you can do them both at once because we all have range. And I believe in your capacity to do both. So next time you're watching a game or a TikTok of something or whatever, give yourself fun times with it, and then also just pose little questions. Why is this what I'm seeing? Why is this happening? Et cetera, et cetera. And that goes a long way.
What you're saying is, in the vibrant gray. Yes. I would like to give another round of applause to this amazing, amazing panelists. Thank you to our hosts for giving us this time and space to be in dialogue together. I know there were a lot of other questions. I know there's a lunch right now. I'm sorry we held you just a few minutes until then, but please come find us. We want to keep talking about this. That's why we're here. So thank you to all of you. Thank you to Dr. Waller and Dr. LaPlante, and we'll see you at lunch.
Speaking of lunch, just quickly, sorry, before you leave, we do have lunch. We'd love for all of you to join us for lunch. Keep this conversation going. I do want to thank the panel because the summit model we use is not a typical academic conference. We don't want people reading papers. We want people conversing with you and with each other in ways that are accessible, and you did that brilliantly. So thank you very much for that. Lunch today is a little bit longer time slot than we'll have tomorrow. It's 12 to 1:30. It's in the tent just outside the Dodd Center. Our next panels will start promptly at 1:30 on resistant sport and human rights. But at 12:30, we're going to have a special session. Skylar has agreed to share in a smaller, more intimate session some of his personal story and his experience. That will be in the Class of 47 room in the library next door. We will make sure if you're not from here that you know where that's at. We can escort you there. So if you would love to attend that, please grab a quick lunch. That starts at 12:30. It'll end by 1:25, so we can have everyone back in here for the start at 1:30. So please, the lunches, breaks are meant for networking and conversation. Please take advantage of it. We'll see you either at Skylar's talk or back here at 1:30. Thank you.